After a heated argument, her billionaire husband abandoned her at a lonely bus stop with no money. Then a mysterious woman appeared and said, "Are you Jane? Follow me. Your $763 million inheritance is waiting." "Hi, my beautiful family. Welcome back to Mr. Peter's family. May the Almighty bless every woman with the strength of 1,000 hearts and the calm of divine grace. May her voice shake mountains, her love heal generations, and her spirit remain unbroken no matter how heavy the storm. She is not just the soul of the family, she is the fire that keeps it alive, the crown that gives life its meaning. My precious family, never let a woman feel unseen. Stand beside her, honor her, and protect her light, because when you uplift a woman, you uplift humanity itself. If your heart is true, like the video. If your love is real, write, "I am with Mr. Peter." The rain didn't care that she was breaking, and neither did he. Jane Morris pressed her forehead against the cold window of the luxury sedan, watching the city lights blur into watercolor streaks through the downpour. Her husband's knuckles were white on the steering wheel, his jaw clenched so tight she could hear his teeth grinding. They had been driving in hostile silence for 20 minutes, ever since Christopher Parker had stormed out of his mother's house with Jane's wrist trapped in his iron grip. "You're hurting me," she whispered, but her words evaporated into the tension that filled every inch of the car. Christopher said nothing. His eyes stayed fixed on the road ahead, but Jane could see the rage simmering beneath his carefully controlled exterior. This was the man she had spent 6 years building up, sacrificing everything for, loving with a devotion that had cost her dreams, her education, her very sense of self. And now he looked at her like she was a stranger, worse than a stranger, an enemy. As he shoved her toward the car outside his mother's house, Jane's eyes had caught on a dark sedan parked down the street, its lights off. It seemed odd, out of place somehow, but Christopher's iron grip on her arm stole all her attention before she could process the observation properly. The car jerked to a sudden stop. Jane looked up and felt her stomach drop into her shoes. They were at a bus stop on the edge of the city where urban development gave way to industrial wasteland. Abandoned warehouses stretched into darkness on one side, dense woods pressed against the road on the other. There wasn't another soul in sight. "Get out!" His voice was flat, emotionless. Jane turned to stare at him, searching for any trace of the man who had once promised her the world. "Christopher, please, just listen to me. Those deposits in my account, they're from—" I said, "Get out." He didn't raise his voice, which somehow made it worse. The coldness in his tone cut deeper than any scream could have. "I don't have my purse. You took my phone. There's no money in my pockets." Her voice cracked despite her best efforts to stay calm. She needed him to hear her, to see reason through whatever poison his mother had poured into his mind. "You've been getting secret payments for months. Thousands of dollars I knew nothing about. Money disappearing from our accounts. Meeting someone at hotels while I worked myself to exhaustion building our future." He finally looked at her, and the hatred in his eyes made her flinch. "My mother showed me everything, Jane. The bank statements, the hotel receipts, the records of your meetings with him. Don't insult me by pretending you're innocent. I am innocent." The words burst from her throat, raw and desperate. "Christopher, I have never cheated on you. I have never stolen from you. Those deposits are from a lawyer handling my deceased aunt's estate. An aunt I didn't know existed because my mother never told me about her family. The lawyer kept calling, but your mother must have been intercepting the calls, because I barely got any of them. Please, Christopher, please believe me." Something flickered across his face, so quick she almost missed it. Doubt maybe, or just the shadow of the man who had once loved her before his mother's poison took root. Then it was gone, replaced by that terrible certainty again. "Get out of my car." His voice was quieter now, which somehow made it worse. "I'm done with you, Jane. Done with your lies, done with your excuses, done with pretending you're anything other than exactly what my mother always said you were. A nobody who saw an opportunity and took it. Well, congratulations. You almost fooled me." Twice during the drive, Jane had thought she saw the same dark sedan in the reflection of rain-slicked shop windows, but the car was always gone when she looked in the side mirror. She dismissed it as paranoia, as her mind creating patterns from fear. Now, standing at this desolate bus stop, she wished desperately that someone, anyone, was following them. "I gave you everything." Jane heard her voice crack and hated herself for it. "I deferred my scholarship so you could start your firm. I worked 3 jobs so you wouldn't have to worry about money while you built your dream. I donated my bone marrow to save Natalie's life. I've given you 6 years of my life, Christopher. 6 years of sacrifice and exhaustion and putting your needs before my own. And you're going to throw me away because your mother showed you fake evidence." "It's not fake." But something in his voice wavered, just barely. "She had documentation, proof. Proof she created!" Jane grabbed his arm, desperate to make him see reason. "Think about it. Your mother has hated me from the moment we met. She's never thought I was good enough for you. She's been trying to break us up for years. And the second some money shows up in my account from a legitimate legal source, suddenly she has all this evidence of an affair? Doesn't that seem convenient to you?" Christopher yanked his arm away from her touch like she'd burned him. "My mother loves me. She wants what's best for me. You're just trying to turn me against her because you got caught." The unfairness of it stole her breath. Jane stared at this man who wore her husband's face, but spoke like a stranger. She thought about begging. She thought about crying, pleading, throwing herself at his mercy. But something in his eyes told her it would be useless. He had already decided she was guilty. The trial was over before it had begun. "Get out of my car, Jane. I'm done with you." She could have fought harder, could have refused to leave, forced him to physically drag her from the car. But something in his eyes made it clear he didn't care if she walked into the storm and never came back. Maybe that was exactly what he wanted. Jane stepped out into the rain. The cold hit her immediately, soaking through her thin dress within seconds. She heard the locks click behind her, sealing her out. Through the water streaming down the window, she could see Christopher's face, hard and unforgiving. He didn't look away. He wanted her to see his resolve, wanted her to understand that this wasn't a moment of anger he'd regret later. This was his choice, deliberate and final. Then he pulled away from the curb, her taillights disappearing into the storm, and Jane was alone. She stood there shaking, arms wrapped around herself, watching the empty road where his car had vanished. The bus stop shelter offered minimal protection, its roof leaking in 3 places. Water pooled around her feet. She had no idea how to get home. She had no way to call anyone. The nearest lit building was miles away through the storm. For a moment, Jane thought about crying, about breaking down completely, letting the rain hide her tears while she fell apart. But something strange was happening inside her chest. The part of her that had been cracking, that had been breaking under the weight of Christopher's accusations and contempt, suddenly stopped. Everything went very quiet and very still. She had given this man everything. She had sacrificed her education, her health, her dreams, her very identity to build him up. And he had repaid her by believing the worst of her without hesitation, by throwing her away like trash, by abandoning her in the rain without a second thought. Jane felt something cold and hard crystallize where her heart used to be. Then she saw the headlights cutting through the storm. A black car emerged from the darkness, moving slowly, deliberately. It didn't stop in front of her. It pulled up behind her, and Jane heard the engine shut off. A door opened, and a woman stepped out holding an umbrella, walking toward Jane with unhurried grace despite the downpour. She was elegant, silver-haired, wearing clothes that whispered money in ways that didn't need to shout. When she reached Jane, she held the umbrella over both of them, her eyes holding sympathy but also something sharper. Knowledge, purpose. "Jane Morris?" the woman asked, her voice cultured and calm. Every survival instinct Jane possessed screamed danger. Strange woman, isolated location, no way to call for help. But she was already destroyed, already abandoned, already lost. What more could possibly happen to her tonight? "Who wants to know?" Jane heard herself ask, her voice steadier than she expected. "My name is Vivian Ashford. We've been trying to contact you for 3 months about a substantial inheritance. When we confirmed your mother-in-law was intercepting our correspondence, we began active surveillance to ensure we could reach you directly. We followed you from the house tonight." She paused, studying Jane's soaked, shivering form with what looked like genuine concern. "It seems we arrived just in time." Jane stared at this stranger who'd apparently been watching her, tracking her movements, following her to this moment of complete abandonment. The surveillance should have felt creepy, invasive. Instead, it felt like the first piece of solid ground in a world that had just tilted sideways. "Why should I believe you?" Jane asked. "Because I have documentation in my car that proves everything I'm saying. Because I've spent 3 months watching Diane Parker block every attempt we made to contact you legally. Because your mother was Thomas Ashford's daughter, and he recently passed away, leaving his entire estate to his only living heir." Vivian paused, letting that sink in. "And because right now, standing in the rain after your husband abandoned you, you have nothing left to lose by hearing me out." Jane looked down the road one last time, toward the darkness where Christopher had disappeared without a second thought. She thought about going after him, about proving her innocence, about fighting for a marriage to a man who had valued her so little he could throw her away without hesitation. Then she thought about something else, about power, about choices, about what it would feel like to stop being the woman everyone underestimated and become someone no one would dare discard again. "If what you're saying is true," Jane said slowly, looking back at Vivian, "if I really inherited this money and power, what happens next?" Vivian smiled, and it was the smile of someone who recognized a kindred spirit. "That depends entirely on what you want, Jane. Do you want to prove your innocence to a man who didn't believe in you? Or do you want to become someone so powerful that his belief becomes irrelevant?" Jane stood in the rain for one more moment, feeling the cold, feeling the betrayal, feeling 6 years of sacrifice and devotion curdle into something else entirely, something sharp and patient and unforgiving. She walked to Vivian's car and climbed into the warm interior. As they pulled away from the bus stop, Jane didn't look back at the place where her old life had ended. She was too busy imagining what her new life could become. And in that future, Christopher Parker would learn exactly what it cost to abandon the only person who had ever truly loved him. Chapter 2. The Transformation. The Ashford estate materialized through the rain like something from a dream, all stone and elegance rising from grounds that stretched beyond what Jane could see in the darkness. Vivian guided the car up a winding drive lined with ancient trees, their branches creating a canopy overhead. When they stopped in front of massive oak doors, Jane stepped out and simply stared. The building before her could have contained her entire previous life 10 times over, and still had room for more. "Your grandmother is waiting," Vivian said gently, her hand light on Jane's elbow as she guided her up marble steps that gleamed even in the rain. Inside, everything whispered wealth in ways that didn't need to shout. The floors reflected light like mirrors. Paintings hung on walls that Jane instinctively knew were originals, not prints. Fresh flowers arranged in crystal vases filled the air with perfume. Jane became painfully aware of her appearance, soaked dress clinging to her body, hair plastered to her skull, shoes leaving wet marks on those perfect floors. She looked like exactly what Christopher's mother had always called her, nobody. A woman descended the curved staircase with the bearing of someone who had never questioned her place in the world. Colette Ashford had to be in her late 70s, but she moved with straight-backed grace. White hair styled in elegant waves, her silk dress clearly made by hands that understood quality. She reached the bottom step and stopped, studying Jane with sharp eyes that took in everything. "You have Catherine's face," Colette said, her voice carrying decades of authority. "My son's most beautiful child, and the only one brave enough to choose love over money. Come here." Jane walked forward on legs that felt unsteady. She didn't know what to expect, But it wasn't for this elegant stranger to pull her into an embrace that smelled of expensive perfume and something deeper, something like longing. "I searched for you for so many years," Colette whispered against Jane's wet hair. "After Catherine died, you disappeared into the system with your father. By the time we found you, you were already married. Thomas wanted to approach you carefully, let the lawyers handle it properly. Then that woman started blocking our communications. We tried everything except showing up at your door, and Thomas thought that would frighten you. He died hoping to meet you." Jane felt the words, but couldn't quite absorb them. Her grandfather she'd never known had died wanting to see her. A family she'd never imagined had been searching. Her mother, who had worked herself to death cleaning houses, had come from this world. Why did she leave? Jane's voice came out rough. Colette's expression shifted with old pain. "Because Thomas refused to let her marry your father. He was a good man, but he had nothing. Thomas was a fool who thought breeding mattered more than love. Catherine proved him wrong by walking away from everything. Her pride was absolute." She studied Jane carefully. "I see that same pride in you now. Tell me what your husband did tonight." Jane's throat tightened. She didn't want to relive it, didn't want to speak the words that would make it real. But Colette waited with patient expectation, and somehow the story emerged. The deposits from estate lawyers, Diane Parker's fabricated evidence, Christopher's accusations, the abandonment at the bus stop, the cold certainty in his eyes that she was guilty of crimes she'd never committed. When Jane finished, Colette walked to a sideboard and poured amber liquid into crystal glasses. She handed one to Jane without asking if she wanted it. "To Catherine," Colette said, raising her glass, "who taught her daughter how to survive everything except men who take without giving." The liquor burned Jane's throat, but she welcomed it. Fire felt cleansing. "What do you want now?" Colette asked, settling into a chair that probably cost more than Jane had earned in total over 6 years of working multiple jobs. Jane sat across from her, watching her wet dress leave marks on expensive upholstery. "I don't know. I don't know anything about this world or how to be whoever you need me to be. I don't need you to be anyone except yourself. But I'll teach you how to navigate this world, how to use the tools you've inherited." Colette leaned forward slightly. "Wealth isn't just money, Jane. It's power, influence, access. Most importantly, it's choices. You've spent your entire adult life with no choices, bending yourself to someone else's needs. Now you decide what you want." What did she want? Jane turned the question over, thinking about Christopher's contemptuous face, about Diane Parker's triumphant smile, about how small they had made her feel, how invisible, how disposable. "I want them to know," Jane said slowly, the words crystallizing as she spoke. "I want them to understand what they threw away. I want Christopher to realize every assumption he made was wrong. I want his mother to choke on her prejudice. I want them to see me not as something they discarded, but as someone who never needed them at all." Colette's smile was sharp with approval. "Then we'll make certain they see you. But first you become someone they won't recognize. We transform the exterior while strengthening what's already inside. Can you handle that?" "I don't know," Jane admitted. "Everything I thought I knew just collapsed." "Good. It's easier to build something new from ruins than renovate a structure someone else designed for you. We start tomorrow." Colette stood, ending the conversation with practiced efficiency. "Tonight you rest and process. Tomorrow you begin learning how to be an Ashford." Vivian led Jane up the grand staircase, past hallways lined with family portraits. Jane caught glimpses of her mother's face in some paintings, young and vibrant before life wore her down. Catherine Ashford, who had chosen love and poverty over wealth and obligation. Jane wondered if her mother had regretted that choice in the end, working herself to death before turning 40. The suite Vivian showed her was larger than Jane's entire former apartment. A massive bed dominated one wall. French doors opened onto a balcony overlooking gardens that stretched into darkness. "Bathroom is through there," Vivian said. "I've had things brought up for you. Nothing permanent, just enough for tonight and tomorrow. We'll take you shopping once you've rested." After Vivian left, Jane stood in the middle of the suite, trying to make sense of the past hours. This morning, she'd been Jane Parker, struggling wife of an ambitious architect. Tonight, she was Jane Morris Ashford, heiress to a fortune she couldn't comprehend, standing in a mansion that belonged to her family. She walked to the bathroom and saw herself in the mirror. Her reflection looked back, eyes hollowed by exhaustion and betrayal, skin pale, hair tangled from rain and trauma. She looked like someone who had survived a war. Jane stripped off wet clothes and stepped into a shower with water pressure that felt therapeutic. She stood under hot spray until her skin turned pink, washing away rain and cold, and the memory of Christopher's hand bruising her wrist. But she couldn't wash away his voice, calling her a liar, a thief, a cheater. The towels waiting were thick and perfect. The robe fit like it had been made for her. Jane climbed into the enormous bed and lay staring at the ceiling, exhausted but unable to sleep. Her mind replayed the moment Christopher told her to get out of his car, the casual cruelty, the absolute certainty that she had betrayed him. He had believed his mother over her. He had believed fake evidence over 6 years of devotion. He had thrown away their marriage based on lies, and he'd done it without hesitation. Jane felt tears slide down her temples into her hair, but they weren't the tears she expected. They weren't sad or broken. They were furious. She had wasted 6 years on a man who valued her so little he could discard her at a bus stop without a second thought. She had poured herself into his dreams until she had nothing left, and he'd repaid her by believing the worst without even asking for her truth. He had made his choice. He had decided she was guilty, decided she deserved abandonment, decided their marriage was worth less than his mother's poison. Jane would make certain he spent the rest of his life regretting that decision. She closed her eyes and felt something settle in her chest. Not peace, but purpose. Colette had asked what she wanted. Jane wanted Christopher to understand what he'd lost. She wanted him to watch her rise to heights he couldn't imagine while he dealt with consequences of his cruelty. She wanted him to suffer the way she had suffered, standing alone in the rain, cast aside like garbage. But more than that, she wanted to prove she had never needed him, that every sacrifice she'd made had been wasted on someone unworthy, that the best revenge wasn't destroying him, but becoming so successful his entire existence became irrelevant to her happiness. Tomorrow, Jane thought as sleep finally claimed her. Tomorrow, she would start becoming someone Christopher Parker would never recognize, someone he would spend the rest of his life wishing he hadn't thrown away. Chapter 3. The Silent Storm. The next week unfolded like entering a different reality. Jane moved through the Ashford estate, absorbing lessons she'd never imagined needing. Colette brought in specialists who taught her about the family holdings, about investments and corporate structure, about how wealth functioned beyond simply having money in accounts. Jane discovered she had natural talent for strategy, for seeing patterns and connections that others missed. "You're Catherine's daughter," Colette said during one session, approval clear in her voice. She had the same sharp mind. Thomas never appreciated it properly. He thought women existed for decoration and producing heirs. I spent decades proving him wrong while pretending to simply support him. You won't have to pretend. Stylists arrived to teach Jane about presence, about how appearance opened doors that talent alone couldn't. Jane learned to walk differently, carry herself with unconscious confidence of someone who'd never been told she wasn't good enough. She learned which fork to use at formal dinners, how to make conversation with powerful people, how to project authority without speaking. It felt like putting on armor, one piece at a time. "You're not learning this because you need their approval," Colette instructed during etiquette lessons. "You're learning so they can't use your ignorance as a weapon. In this world, presentation is power. Let them underestimate you, and they'll destroy you. Force them to take you seriously, and they'll fear you." Between lessons, Jane researched Christopher's firm in the estate library. She learned his architecture business was struggling more than she'd realized. He'd taken on debt to expand too quickly, backed by investors growing impatient for returns. Diane had apparently invested her own money to keep him afloat, which explained her massive influence over his decisions. Jane made quiet phone calls through intermediaries. She discovered Christopher's company was weeks from defaulting on crucial loans. His largest project had stalled due to permit issues, and the client was threatening to walk away. He was circling financial disaster and didn't seem to know it yet. She could destroy him with one phone call. She could call in debts through banks that would listen to an Ashford. She could make the permit issues permanent, push him into bankruptcy before he understood what was happening. But Jane did something else. Entirely, she established an anonymous investment through a shell company and paid off Christopher's most pressing debts. She pulled strings to get his permits approved. She ensured his client stayed committed. She saved his company from immediate collapse, and she made certain he'd never know she was behind it. "Why?" Vivian asked when Jane explained her actions. "Because I want him standing when I knock him down," Jane said quietly. "I want him confident and secure. Then I want him to watch it all disappear and know it was me. Quick destruction is mercy. I want him to suffer slowly enough to understand every moment of what he's losing." 3 months passed. Christopher filed for divorce citing abandonment. Jane's lawyer advised fighting it, but Jane signed every paper without contest. She gave him everything, the apartment, car, their minimal savings. She didn't want anything that tied her to him. Let him think he'd won. Let him believe she'd slunk away in shame while he moved on. The divorce processed without Jane ever appearing. Christopher apparently told everyone she'd run off with another man, taken hidden money, betrayed him completely. Diane backed this story, playing the sympathetic parent whose son had been victimized by an ungrateful nobody. Jane heard all this through quiet channels that money opened. She learned Christopher had started dating Bethany Winters, a socialite from an established family, exactly the kind of woman Diane had always wanted him to marry. She saw photos of them at gallery openings. Christopher's arm around Bethany's waist, his smile confident. Good, Jane thought. Let him feel secure. Let him think he'd traded up. Meanwhile, Jane enrolled in accelerated programs, absorbing knowledge like she'd been starved for it. She attended Ashford Industries board meetings as an observer, sitting quietly while Colette and executives discussed strategy. But Jane was listening, learning, connecting patterns. At one meeting, she spoke for the first time. "We're approaching the Reynolds contract wrong. They don't want cheaper, they want faster. If we propose premium materials at higher cost, but guarantee accelerated delivery, they'll accept. Their real problem is timeline, not budget." 15 executives stared at this newcomer who'd barely spoken in weeks. Then the acquisitions director checked his notes, made calls, came back nodding. She's right. Reynolds has an undisclosed deadline. They need completion before their fiscal year ends, or they lose funding. He looked at Jane with new respect. "How did you know?" "I read their annual report. Their funding renewal is contingent on completing this project. They're not negotiating price, they're negotiating panic. We should charge premium and guarantee delivery." Colette smiled at Jane across the conference table, pride evident. "Make it happen." Jane left the meeting feeling powerful for the first time since that night at the bus stop. She'd identified an opportunity, proposed a strategy, and been proven correct. This was her world now. These were her skills. She belonged here, but she wasn't done yet. She had a personal target in mind. "I want us to pursue Reynolds aggressively," Jane told her acquisitions director privately after the meeting. "Christopher Parker's firm currently handles their architectural work. I want us to offer Reynolds terms they can't refuse. Superior service, better timeline guarantees, Ashford's reputation backing the project. Make it irresistible." The director looked surprised. "You want us to specifically target Parker's firm?" "I want us to pursue good business," Jane said smoothly. "If that happens to affect Parker's firm, that's simply market forces at work." Over the next 2 weeks, Jane's team worked to put together a proposal that would make Ashford Industries Reynolds' clear choice for future projects. The numbers were aggressive but sustainable. The timeline guarantees were ambitious but achievable. The package was designed to be impossible to refuse. Jane felt satisfaction building as the pieces came together. This would be her first real blow against Christopher's firm. 40% of his revenue would evaporate, and he'd never know she was behind it. She'd start dismantling his professional life the same way he'd dismantled hers, piece by careful piece. The day before they were scheduled to present the proposal to Reynolds, her acquisitions director appeared at her office door, looking confused and frustrated. "We have a problem with the Reynolds situation," he said, closing the door behind him. "Something unexpected happened." Jane's chest tightened. "What kind of problem?" "Reynolds backed out of considering our proposal entirely. They're staying with Parker's firm despite our superior offer. My contacts at Reynolds say Diane Parker had dinner with Reynolds' wife last week. Apparently, she spread some very compelling stories about you being an unstable, vindictive woman who's only targeting her son's firm out of spite from a messy divorce. She painted a picture of drama and chaos that made Reynolds nervous about getting caught in the middle of personal vendettas. They decided to play it safe and stick with what they know." Jane felt fury rising in her chest, hot and immediate. Her first major move against Christopher had failed. Diane Parker, from her wheelchair, partially paralyzed, had still managed to outmaneuver her. The woman who had destroyed Jane's marriage was now actively sabotaging her business strategies. "How did Diane even know we were pursuing Reynolds?" Jane demanded. "She didn't need to know specifically. Based on what my contacts told me, she's been making rounds to everyone in Christopher's professional network, proactively spreading the narrative that you're dangerous and unstable. She's poisoning every potential well before we even approach it. She's treating your entry into this world as a direct threat, and she's mobilizing her entire social network against you." After he left, Jane sat alone in her office, staring at nothing, feeling the sting of failure for the first time since she'd entered this world. She'd been so focused on financial power, on corporate maneuvering, on the tools she was learning. She'd forgotten that Diane Parker had spent 40 years building influence and relationships. The woman didn't need money to fight. She had something more dangerous. She had reputation and social capital and a network of people who believed her stories. Colette appeared in her doorway that evening, moving slowly with her cane. She'd clearly heard about the Reynolds situation. "You're learning an important lesson," Colette said, settling into the chair across from Jane's desk. "In this world, money isn't enough. Diane's weapon is influence, carefully cultivated over decades. You just brought a balance sheet to a knife fight. She destroyed my marriage, and now she's destroying my business strategies," Jane said, not bothering to hide her frustration. "How do I fight someone who's already poisoned everyone against me?" "You can't fight her on her terms. She has 40 years of social capital you can't match in 3 months. But you can neutralize her by removing her sources of information and influence." Colette leaned forward. "You need someone inside Christopher's operation. Someone who understands what Diane knows, who she's talking to, how she's positioning her narrative. You need intelligence before you can plan effective strategy." Jane thought about this carefully. Christopher's business partner, Richard Hollis. Is he loyal to Christopher? I don't think Richard is loyal to anyone but himself. And self-interested people can be persuaded to share information if the price is right. Colette smiled. "Now you're thinking like an Ashford. Money alone won't win this war. But money combined with intelligence, strategy, and understanding your enemy's movements, that's how you dismantle someone who thinks they're untouchable." Jane spent the next week researching Richard Hollis with obsessive attention to detail. She learned about his financial situation, his ambitions, his weaknesses. She discovered he'd been passed over for full partnership status twice. She found evidence of gambling debts and lifestyle spending that exceeded his income. Most importantly, she found connections between Richard and Diane Parker that Christopher didn't seem to know about. When she finally requested a meeting with Richard through back channels, she wasn't going in blind. She was going in armed with leverage, information, and a clear strategy for turning Christopher's supposed friend into her informant. This was her adaptation. Diane had taught her an important lesson with the Reynolds failure. Now Jane was going to use that lesson to ensure her next attack would be unstoppable. Chapter 4. The Phantom Investor. The museum felt too small to contain what was happening between them. Jane stood near a sculpture discussing conservation techniques with Bethany, while every nerve in her body tracked Christopher's presence. He hadn't moved since his champagne glass shattered. Museum staff had cleaned the broken crystal, but Christopher remained frozen, staring at Jane like she might evaporate if he blinked. "Are you all right, darling?" Bethany touched his arm, her tone carrying irritation at being ignored during an important social event. Christopher jerked like someone had struck him. "I'm fine. I just thought I recognized someone. Oh, do you two know each other?" Bethany looked between them with mild curiosity, completely missing the live current of tension crackling through the air around them. Jane finally met Christopher's gaze directly, her expression politely neutral. "We've crossed paths before. I'm sure Christopher barely remembers it." The words landed like a slap. Christopher's jaw tightened, and Jane watched him struggle with whether to expose their history in front of Bethany, weighing options, trying to find solid ground in a situation that had become quicksand beneath his feet. Diane Parker materialized beside her son with perfect timing. She took in the scene with sharp eyes that moved from Christopher's stricken expression to Jane's cool composure to Bethany's growing confusion. And like her son, Diane recognized Jane immediately despite the transformation. All color drained from her carefully made-up face. "Christopher, we should circulate," Diane said tightly, her fingers closing on her son's elbow with visible force. "Mrs. Ashford, always lovely to see you." "Diane," Colette acknowledged with a smile that contained sharp edges beneath polite veneer. "I don't believe you've properly met my granddaughter, Jane Ashford. She's recently taken her rightful place in our family business." Jane extended her hand to Diane, watching the older woman realize she had no choice but to take it without causing a scene. Diane's palm was cold and slightly damp, her grip weak. "How wonderful for you both," Diane managed, forcing the words through what looked like clenched teeth. "The pleasure is entirely mine," Jane said warmly, her tone impeccable. "I've heard such interesting things about your family's involvement in the arts community. Christopher's architecture firm has built quite a reputation in the city." Diane's eyes narrowed at the casual use of her son's first name, at the familiarity it suggested. Christopher was still staring at Jane like she'd returned from the dead, and he couldn't quite accept the evidence of his eyes. "How do you know about my firm?" Christopher finally found his voice, though it came out rougher than he'd probably intended. "I make it my business to know about promising ventures in the city that might intersect with Ashford Industries' interests," Jane replied smoothly. "We're expanding into property development and urban design. Naturally, we monitor firms that could become potential collaborators or competitors." The threat embedded in that final word wasn't lost on Christopher. His eyes widened fractionally as comprehension started filtering through his shock. "Well," Bethany said into the thick silence, clearly sensing undercurrents she didn't understand, "perhaps we could arrange a meeting sometime. Christopher's firm is always interested in partnership opportunities with established companies like yours." "I'm sure something could be arranged if circumstances align properly," Jane said, knowing she would never allow such a meeting to materialize. She turned to Colette with perfect timing. "Grandmother, didn't you want to speak with the curator about the new wing expansion?" Colette took the cue immediately. "Yes, of course. Lovely seeing you all." As they moved away through the crowd, Jane felt Christopher's eyes burning into her back with intensity that was almost physical. She didn't look back, didn't acknowledge him, just continued through the gala with Colette at her side, greeting other guests, networking with people who mattered, performing the role of society heiress like she'd been born knowing how to do it. That was beautifully brutal, Colette murmured appreciatively when they were safely out of earshot. The way you twisted the knife without him even understanding the full extent of the wound yet. Catherine would have been extraordinarily proud. His mother recognized me immediately, Jane said quietly, accepting a glass of champagne from a passing waiter. She looked absolutely terrified, as she should be. Diane Parker's entire power structure is built on her son's success and her carefully cultivated social position. You just revealed yourself as someone with resources to dismantle both. She's intelligent enough to see the threat, even if Christopher is too stunned to think clearly. Watch your back, Jane. She'll be making moves against you now that she knows you're in play. The warning proved prophetic. 3 days after the gala, Jane was reviewing reports when her phone rang with a call from one of her board members, someone Colette had specifically identified as trustworthy. Jane, I thought you should know that Diane Parker has been calling people. She reached out to me yesterday with what she called a concerned warning about a troubled young woman. She's spreading a narrative that you're mentally unstable, that you've been threatening her family, that you're using Ashford resources to pursue a personal vendetta against her innocent son. She's being very careful with her language, positioning everything as worry rather than accusation, but the intent is clear. She's trying to undermine your credibility before you can establish yourself. Jane felt cold fury settle over her. How many people has she contacted? From what I'm hearing, at least a dozen key players in your industry sectors. She's strategic about it too. She's not going to your direct reports or obvious allies. She's targeting people on the periphery who don't know you well yet, people whose opinions could influence broader perception. She's trying to create whisper networks that paint you as volatile and vindictive before you can build your own reputation. After that call, Jane spent the day reaching out to her contacts, trying to understand the scope of Diane's campaign. What she discovered was both impressive and infuriating. Diane Parker, from her wheelchair, partially paralyzed, was conducting a masterclass in social warfare. She was using 40 years of carefully cultivated relationships to poison wells Jane hadn't even identified yet. She's better at this than I anticipated, Jane admitted to Colette that evening. I thought saving Christopher's firm and then slowly dismantling it would be enough. I didn't account for his mother actively defending him at a social level. That's because you were thinking like someone who has money, Colette said. Diane is thinking like someone who has influence. Those are different weapons, and right now, hers is more effective than yours. You need to change your approach entirely. How do I fight someone who's already convinced people I'm unstable? You don't fight her narrative directly. That just makes you look defensive and proves her point. Instead, you gather intelligence. You understand exactly what she knows, who she's talking to, and where her information comes from. Then you cut off her sources and use what you learn to outmaneuver her completely. Colette paused. Which brings us back to Christopher's business partner. You mentioned looking into Richard Hollis. I have. Jane pulled up files on her tablet. He's gambling debts, lifestyle spending beyond his means, ambitions that Christopher keeps blocking. And most importantly, he has direct connections to Diane Parker that predate my marriage. Phone records show frequent communication between them going back years. Then Richard is your way inside. Someone already in Diane's pocket might be persuaded to work in yours instead, especially if his current patron can't pay what you're offering. The meeting with Richard Hollis took place 2 days later in a private room at an upscale restaurant downtown. Jane had done her homework thoroughly. She knew his financial pressures, his resentments, his weaknesses. She knew exactly how to appeal to someone whose loyalty was for sale to the highest bidder. Richard arrived looking prosperous and confident, clearly expecting to negotiate with some faceless corporate entity he could potentially charm or intimidate into different behavior. His expression when Jane walked through the door was absolutely priceless, shock and confusion warring across his features as he struggled to process what he was seeing. You? He half stood from his chair, visibly struggling to reconcile his expectations with reality. "But you're supposed to be nothing. You're just Christopher's ex-wife who ran off." "Jane Ashford," she said smoothly, taking the seat across from him with unhurried grace. "I believe you were expecting someone different. Shall we discuss why you requested this meeting, or would you prefer to continue expressing shock?" Richard settled back into his chair, his mind visibly racing to recalibrate his entire approach to this conversation. He'd known her as Jane Parker, Christopher's struggling wife, someone completely irrelevant to his professional world and beneath his notice. Now she sat before him radiating power and wealth, revealed as someone who could destroy or elevate his career with equal ease. "I don't understand how you went from homeless to Ashford Industries," Richard said finally, abandoning pretense of casual confidence. "Family connections I wasn't previously aware of." Jane replied vaguely, offering no details that might satisfy his curiosity. "But we're not here to discuss my personal journey. You reached out requesting a meeting with whoever was targeting Christopher Parker's firm. I'm told you have concerns about becoming collateral damage. Is that accurate?" Richard leaned forward, his expression shifting to the calculated friendliness of someone making a sales pitch. "Look, I don't know what history you have with Christopher personally, but his firm's troubles don't need to become my problems. I'm technically just a junior partner, really more of an employee. If you're specifically targeting Parker for some reason, I'd like to propose that you and I work together instead of my getting caught as collateral damage in whatever this is between you two." "You want to betray your business partner?" Jane stated flatly, making it sound exactly as ugly as it was. "I want to survive and ideally prosper. Christopher is stubborn to a fault. He's going to fight you, even if resistance destroys him completely. I'm considerably more pragmatic and flexible. If you're dismantling his firm regardless, why shouldn't I benefit from helping you do it efficiently and providing you with information that makes your campaign more effective?" Jane studied him for a long moment, letting silence stretch uncomfortably between them. This was the man Christopher had trusted enough to bring into his firm, had considered a friend and ally, had relied on for support and loyalty. And Richard was ready to turn on Christopher the instant it became personally advantageous, without hesitation or apparent guilt about the betrayal. "Before we discuss any potential arrangement," Jane said, "I need you to tell me everything about Diane Parker's involvement in Christopher's business and personal life. I need to know the full scope of her influence, her methods, and most importantly, her current activities regarding me specifically." Richard's eyes narrowed slightly. "Why would I give you information before we've agreed on terms?" Jane opened her tablet and pulled up a file, turning the screen to face him. "Because I already have bank records showing unusual deposits into your personal account directly from Diane Parker. I have phone records documenting extensive communication between the two of you over a period of years. I have security footage from hotels where you were present during times that correspond with fabricated evidence in my divorce. And I have testimony from multiple sources about your role in helping Diane destroy my marriage through manufactured proof of infidelity that never occurred." She leaned back, watching color drain from his face. "So the question isn't whether you're going to tell me everything. The question is whether you're going to tell me voluntarily, or whether I'm going to hand all of this evidence to appropriate authorities and let them investigate fraud, conspiracy, and whatever other charges a competent prosecutor can make stick. I'm quite confident Diane would throw you completely under the bus to protect herself and her son. Are you equally confident she'd protect you?" Richard slumped in his chair, defeat written clearly across his features. "What specifically do you want to know?" "And everything," Jane said simply. "And then we'll discuss whether your cooperation earns you a place in whatever comes next, or whether you've simply purchased the privilege of not going to prison." Chapter 5. The First Encounter. The morning after the gala, Jane woke to find a handwritten letter that had been delivered to the Ashford estate overnight. The envelope bore Christopher's handwriting, familiar from years of anniversary cards and grocery lists and notes left on the kitchen counter during their marriage. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened it, hating herself for the physical reaction, for the way her body still remembered loving him, even as her mind had crystallized into something harder and colder. The letter was desperate, scrawled across 3 pages in handwriting that deteriorated as it progressed, becoming increasingly illegible as emotion apparently overtook him. He begged her to meet him, to explain how she'd become connected to the Ashford family, to talk about what had happened to their marriage, and whether there was any possibility of understanding between them. He apologized for doubting her, said he'd been manipulated by his mother, claimed he'd never stopped thinking about her despite everything. He said he understood now that she'd been telling the truth about the inheritance, that he'd made a terrible mistake, and that he needed to see her and somehow make things right between them. Jane read it twice, absorbing every word, every plea, every expression of regret and desperate hope. Then she walked to the fireplace in her suite and watched the pages curl and blacken in the flames. She felt nothing watching them burn. No satisfaction, no anger, not even the bitter vindication she'd expected. Just emptiness where feeling should have been, a hollow space that revenge hadn't managed to fill. 3 more letters arrived over the next week, each increasingly desperate. Jane burned them all without reading past the first paragraph. Christopher's words were irrelevant now. He'd had his chance to believe her that night when it mattered, when she'd stood in the rain, trying to make him understand. Now he could live with the consequences of choosing his mother's lies over Jane's truth, while she systematically dismantled everything he'd built. Jane's team identified Christopher's next vulnerability with efficient precision. His firm had taken on a massive cultural center project, his most ambitious design yet, something that could potentially restore his reputation if executed successfully. But the project required significant upfront capital that Christopher no longer had access to, and the timeline was brutally compressed. He was scrambling to secure financing while trying to keep the project moving forward, caught between the rock of his vision and the hard place of his deteriorating financial reality. Jane arranged for every bank Christopher approached to suddenly discover concerns about his creditworthiness. Loan applications that should have been straightforward became exercises in bureaucratic nightmare. Financing that seemed certain would evaporate at the last moment for vague reasons no one could adequately explain. Christopher was watching his dream project die from lack of funding, and he couldn't understand why doors that should have opened were slamming shut in his face with such coordinated precision. Meanwhile, Jane's reputation in the business world was growing exponentially. Colette had introduced her to the right people, and Jane's natural strategic instincts combined with her authentic understanding of struggle made her surprisingly effective in ways that impressed even hardened executives. People respected her in ways they never would have if she'd simply been born into wealth. She'd earned her place through visible talent, and that commanded a different kind of authority that money alone couldn't purchase. At a corporate luncheon, Jane found herself seated next to an older gentleman who introduced himself as the board chair for the cultural center project Christopher was desperately trying to save. He didn't know about Jane's connection to Christopher, saw her only as the brilliant young Ashford heir everyone was talking about with such interest and approval. "We're having terrible troubles with our architect," he confided over the second course, his frustration evident. "Christopher Parker, talented designer, but his firm is apparently having serious financial difficulties that he didn't disclose when bidding. We're concerned about his ability to complete the project on schedule. We may need to terminate the contract and find someone more stable and reliable." Jane felt power settling over her like a familiar coat. She could destroy Christopher's last hope with a single sentence. could encourage this man to pull the contract immediately and watch Christopher's firm collapse entirely under the weight of this final failure. It would be so easy, so satisfying to deliver that killing blow, but she didn't. "Give him 2 more weeks," Jane heard herself say, the words emerging before she'd fully thought them through. Sometimes the most brilliant work comes from people fighting through adversity. If he can't demonstrate real progress by then, you'll know you gave him every possible chance before making the difficult decision. The board chair looked at her with surprise and approval. "That's remarkably generous given your position. Most people in your situation would simply advise cutting losses immediately to protect the project timeline." Jane smiled, but the expression held no warmth whatsoever. "I'm not interested in being like most people in business. I prefer making decisions I can live with long term." She wasn't being generous. She was extending Christopher's suffering, giving him just enough hope to keep fighting, to keep exhausting himself, to keep believing he might salvage something from the wreckage of his professional life. Then she'd pull the support away at precisely the right moment and watch him fall from even greater height, making the eventual collapse that much more devastating. Colette's health was declining visibly now. She moved more slowly each day, tired more easily, but her mind remained sharp as ever and her observations cutting. She watched Jane navigate the business world with evident pride, occasionally offering advice, but mostly letting Jane find her own path forward. "You're becoming someone formidable," Colette said one evening as they sat together in the estate library. The older woman wrapped in blankets despite the warm room. "Catherine would have been so proud of what you've built from the ruins of what they tried to do to you. You've taken their cruelty and transformed it into power." "I'm not sure I'm building anything meaningful," Jane admitted quietly. "Sometimes I think I'm just destroying things slowly and methodically and calling it justice to make myself feel better about the revenge. There's a difference between destruction for its own sake and dismantling structures that deserve to fall," Colette said firmly. Christopher Parker had everything handed to him, squandered it through arrogance and blind faith in the wrong people, and now he's learning what it feels like to have nothing. "That's not cruelty on your part. That's education he desperately needed." "His sister Natalie keeps trying to reach me," Jane said quietly, not meeting Colette's eyes. "She leaves messages saying Christopher is falling apart completely, that he's not sleeping, barely eating anything. She says the stress is making her condition worse, that watching him suffer is literally killing her. She's begging me to have mercy on him." Colette's expression hardened with something that looked almost like anger. "Natalie is the one you donated bone marrow to save, correct? The one whose life you extended through your own pain and sacrifice?" "Yes." "Then she, of all people, should understand what you sacrificed for that family, without any expectation of gratitude or return," Colette said sharply. "Mercy is what you showed for 6 years, while Christopher took everything and gave nothing in return. Mercy is what you demonstrated when you could have destroyed him immediately, but chose to walk away instead. What you're doing now isn't about mercy or its absence. It's about accountability for choices he made freely." Jane nodded, but something uncomfortable was taking root in her chest, spreading like poison ivy beneath her skin. She'd imagined revenge would feel satisfying, empowering, cleansing like fire, burning away everything painful. Instead, it felt hollow and exhausting, like winning a game that had lost all meaning somewhere along the way. Christopher showed up at the Ashford Industries building on a rainy afternoon weeks later, demanding to see Jane. Security kept him in the lobby while someone called up to Jane's office to inform her of his presence. Her assistant looked at her questioningly, waiting for instructions. "Tell security to remove him from the building immediately," Jane said without hesitation. "If he returns after being warned, they should contact the police about trespassing." "He's been out there for 6 hours already," her assistant said carefully, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. "He looks terrible. He says he'll wait as long as it takes to see you. Then he'll wait forever because I'm not seeing him under any circumstances." but curiosity got the better of her eventually. Jane went to the window overlooking the main entrance and looked down at the street below. Christopher was visible on the sidewalk, pacing back and forth in the rain, his clothes soaked through, but he didn't seem to notice or care. Even from this distance, she could see how much weight he'd lost, how his expensive suit hung on a frame that had been athletic and was now just thin and wasted. He looked up suddenly as if sensing her presence at the window, and their eyes met across the distance, separating them. Jane saw his face transform with desperate hope that was painful to witness. He raised one hand like he was trying to reach her across the impossible space, his mouth forming her name even though she couldn't hear him. Jane stepped back from the window and closed the blinds with a sharp motion. She returned to her desk and continued working, ignoring the knowledge that Christopher was still down there in the rain, standing and waiting for a meeting that would never happen because she refused to grant it. Chapter 6. The Breaking Point. Jane threw herself into work with intensity that bordered on obsession after Colette's death. The estate felt too empty without her grandmother's presence, too full of memories and expectations Jane wasn't certain she could meet. She spent brutal hours at Ashford Industries, proving herself to board members who still saw her as the untested heir, rather than someone who had earned her position. She was in a meeting reviewing acquisition targets when her assistant interrupted, something she'd been explicitly instructed never to do unless the building was actively on fire or some similar emergency. "I'm so sorry," the assistant said, genuine distress evident in her voice. "But there's a woman in the lobby who says it's urgent. Natalie Parker. She says you'll understand why she's here." Jane's chest tightened painfully. She hadn't seen or spoken to Christopher's sister since before everything fell apart between them. Natalie had been sick when Jane donated bone marrow to save her life, too weak to understand family dynamics or take sides in conflicts that didn't directly involve her medical treatment. "Tell her I'm in meetings all day," Jane said automatically, the refusal coming without thought. "She says she's not leaving until you see her. She's been down there for 3 hours already. Security says she looks really unwell, like she might collapse." Jane closed her eyes briefly. She didn't want this confrontation, didn't want to face Natalie's pain, or hear about Christopher's suffering, or be asked for mercy she wasn't ready to give. But Natalie had never done anything to hurt Jane. Natalie was collateral damage in a war she'd never asked to be part of. "Give me 5 minutes to wrap up here, then send her up to my office." When Natalie walked through the door, Jane felt shock ripple through her, despite the warning about her appearance. The woman who entered was gaunt beyond recognition, her skin carrying grey pallor that spoke of serious illness returning with a vengeance. She'd lost significant weight since Jane had last seen her, moved carefully like someone in constant pain, but her eyes were clear and determined in her wasted face. "Thank you for seeing me," Natalie said, lowering herself into the chair across from Jane's desk with visible effort and poorly concealed pain. "I know you have no reason to give me any of your time after everything. How are you feeling?" Jane asked, and hated that she still cared enough to ask. That concern for this woman still lived somewhere in her chest, despite everything. The leukemia came back with a vengeance. Aggressive this time. The doctors are trying different treatments, but they're not optimistic about outcomes. Natalie said it matter-of-factly, like discussing the weather rather than her own approaching mortality. "I don't have very long, Jane. Maybe months if I'm extraordinarily lucky. Probably less. I'm sorry to hear that. That's not fair to you." "Life rarely is fair. You know that better than most people." Natalie leaned forward slightly, her breathing labored from even that small movement. "I'm not here to waste your time or mine with pleasantries. I'm here because I need to say something before I can't anymore. What you did for me, donating your bone marrow and giving me years I wouldn't have had otherwise, that was the most selfless thing anyone has ever done. You barely knew me. You had no obligation to me, but you went through pain and recovery to save a stranger's life. I've never forgotten that gift. You don't owe me anything for that, Jane said quietly. I didn't do it for debt or gratitude or any expectation of return. I know. That's what made it so remarkable. You did it because it was right, because someone needed help you could provide. That's who you were then. I'm hoping that person still exists somewhere underneath all this. Natalie gestured vaguely at Jane's elegant office, at the visible trappings of power and wealth. What do you want, Natalie? I want you to stop destroying my brother systematically. The words hung in the air between them like smoke. Jane felt her expression harden into something cold, felt walls slamming into place around whatever vulnerability Natalie's presence had exposed. Your brother destroyed himself through his own choices. I'm just letting him experience the natural consequences of those decisions. No, you're not being passive, Natalie said firmly despite her weakness. Don't insult me by pretending this is just natural consequences. You've systematically dismantled his professional life, eliminated his income, made it impossible for him to recover. I've heard things, Jane. People talk in certain circles. They say a mysterious Ashford heir has been targeting Parker's firm specifically, going out of her way to destroy someone who should be beneath her notice. That's not consequences playing out naturally. That's active, deliberate revenge being executed with precision. He threw me away like I was nothing, Jane said, her voice low and controlled, but carrying an edge that could cut. He believed lies about me without question or investigation. He abandoned me in the rain with no way to get home, no money, no phone, no resources. He told everyone who would listen that I was a cheater and a thief who had betrayed him. He moved on with someone else before the divorce was even finalized. And now you want me to stop holding him accountable because watching him suffer makes you uncomfortable. He's learning what it feels like to be treated like you're disposable. I genuinely hope it hurts him deeply. It's killing him, Natalie said simply, her voice carrying no judgment, just statement of fact. He's not sleeping at all anymore. He's lost so much weight his clothes don't fit his body anymore. He works all day at a job that pays barely enough to survive on, then comes home and takes care of our mother, who can barely move or speak after her stroke. He sits up at night writing you letters he knows you'll never read or acknowledge. He stands outside your building in the rain, hoping you'll look at him for 5 seconds. He's broken completely, Jane, utterly shattered. And the stress of watching him suffer is quite literally killing me because my condition worsens when I'm under emotional strain. That's not my responsibility, Jane said, but something uncomfortable twisted in her chest beneath the armor. I didn't ask him to fall apart. I didn't ask him to neglect himself or write useless letters. Those are his choices in response to consequences he earned. Just like it was his choice to believe our mother's lies? Natalie asked gently. Just like it was his choice to trust the person who raised him over a wife he'd known for 6 years. You're right that he made terrible mistakes. But Jane, our mother, spent Christopher's entire life manipulating him, controlling him, undermining his confidence in his own judgment, and making him dependent on her approval. She conditioned him from childhood. When she showed him that fabricated evidence, she activated years of psychological conditioning. He was wrong not to question it, wrong to throw you away, wrong in so many ways. But he was also a victim of her systematic psychological abuse, even if he doesn't see it that way, or use it as an excuse. That doesn't excuse what he did to me. Nothing excuses that night. No, it doesn't excuse anything. Nothing could excuse it, but maybe it explains it enough that you could stop actively destroying him and just let him rebuild what he can from the wreckage of his choices. Natalie's breathing was becoming increasingly labored, her skin taking on an unhealthy sheen of perspiration. I'm not asking you to forgive him. I'm not even asking you to speak to him directly. I'm asking you to stop the active campaign of destruction. To let him suffer the natural consequences of his actions without you making everything worse at every turn. To show him the mercy he should have shown you but didn't, not because he deserves it but because you're better than he was. Why should I show mercy to someone who showed me absolutely none? Because you're better than he was in that moment. Natalie said, standing carefully and steadying herself on the desk. Because being better means making different choices even when they're harder. Because revenge is eating you alive, just as much as guilt is eating him alive. And you both deserve better than this endless cycle of pain, creating more pain. She moved toward the door, each step clearly costing energy she didn't have. I'm going to die soon, Jane. When I do, Christopher will have lost almost everything that mattered. His career, his reputation, his partner, his mother's health and mind, and his sister. The only thing left for him to lose is himself, his very identity and will to live. If you keep pushing him with such systematic cruelty, he'll lose that too. Is that really what you want? For him to cease existing entirely because he made terrible mistakes while being manipulated? Jane sat in silence, unable to answer, feeling something crack in the armor she'd built so carefully around herself. She'd imagined revenge would feel satisfying, empowering, cleansing. Instead, it felt exhausting and hollow, like winning a game that had cost far too much to play. Chapter 7. The Confrontation. Natalie died on a Tuesday morning while Jane was in a board meeting discussing quarterly projections and expansion strategies. The message came through from Vivian, just a simple text that said, "Natalie Parker passed away this morning at the hospital. Thought you should know." Jane excused herself from the meeting and went to her office, closing the door and standing at the window overlooking the city spread below. She'd known Natalie was dying. The knowledge had been clinical, factual, expected for weeks. But knowing something intellectually and feeling it emotionally were entirely different experiences. Jane discovered that grief could exist even for someone she barely knew, for a relationship that had mostly been defined by one desperate act of generosity years ago. She attended the funeral, sitting in the back of the church wearing black and large sunglasses, trying to be invisible among the sparse crowd. The turnout was modest. Natalie had been sick so long that many friendships had faded, and Christopher's recent spectacular fall from grace meant their social circle had contracted dramatically. Diane was there in a wheelchair, her partially paralyzed face slack with grief, making sounds that might have been sobs, but came out garbled and incoherent through her damaged mouth. Christopher stood at the front of the church, giving the eulogy, and Jane barely recognized the man she'd once married. He'd lost so much weight that his suit hung on him like it belonged to someone else entirely. His face was gaunt, shadows under his eyes speaking to sleepless nights and relentless stress. His hands shook as he held the paper with his prepared remarks, and his voice broke multiple times as he spoke about his sister's courage, her kindness, her grace in facing death without bitterness. "Natalie was the best of us," Christopher said, his voice raw with grief. "She never asked why bad things happened to her specifically. She just found ways to be grateful for the good she'd been given. She taught me that every day is a gift, that every moment with people you love matters infinitely more than career success or money or reputation. I wish I'd learned that lesson earlier than I did. I wish I'd understood what she was trying to teach me before I lost everything that actually mattered in pursuit of things that didn't." His eyes found Jane in the back of the church during that last sentence, and the devastation in his gaze made her look away quickly. She left before the service ended, unwilling to face him or accept condolences from people who might recognize her and make the situation more complicated. But the image of Christopher's face stayed with her for days afterward. The grief, yes, but also the resignation. He looked like someone who had given up fighting entirely, who had accepted that his life was just going to be this empty thing full of loss and struggle and consequences he'd earned. He looked defeated in a way that went beyond financial ruin or professional failure. He looked spiritually broken in ways that couldn't be repaired. Jane tried to return to work, to normal life, but Natalie's funeral had unsettled something fundamental in her carefully constructed new existence. She found herself thinking about their last conversation, about whether revenge had actually made Jane feel better or just made her feel something instead of nothing, about whether the person she'd become was someone she actually wanted to be. She pulled up the recordings she'd made of Richard's confession. His detailed description of how Diane had paid him to fabricate evidence against Jane. She had comprehensive proof of conspiracy, of fraud, of systematic manipulation. She could send this to Christopher, could show him exactly how he'd been played like a puppet on strings. She could give him the truth he'd refused to see that night at the bus stop. But what would that accomplish, really? Would it heal the wounds he'd inflicted on her? Would it erase the memory of standing alone in the rain, discarded and abandoned? Would it change the fundamental fact that he'd valued her so little, that manufactured evidence was enough to destroy 6 years of marriage without hesitation? Jane didn't know. She only knew she was tired of carrying this weight every single day, tired of organizing her entire life around someone else's destruction, tired of waking up every morning with anger as her first emotion before she'd even opened her eyes. She made a decision she couldn't entirely explain even to herself. She used her extensive contacts to arrange one final meeting with Christopher, not because she owed him anything, but because she owed herself closure that didn't taste like ashes in her mouth. The message that reached him specified time and location with clinical precision. The same bus stop where he'd abandoned her months ago, the same night of the week, exactly 6 months after he'd driven away, leaving her alone in the rain. Jane arrived early in a chauffeur-driven car, dressed in power and money and everything she'd become in his absence. The rain was falling again, not as heavy as that first night, but steady enough to blur streetlights into watercolor streaks. She stood under the bus stop shelter and waited, feeling like she was stepping back into a nightmare she'd fought so hard to escape. Christopher arrived exactly on time, stepping out of a car that was old and battered, so far removed from the luxury sedan he'd driven before. He approached slowly, his clothes immediately soaking through in the rain, but he didn't seem to notice. His entire focus was on Jane, his expression raw with hope and desperation and fear all mixed together. "You came," he said, his voice barely audible over the rain drumming on the shelter roof. "I came," Jane confirmed, her tone giving nothing away. "You wanted to talk. You have 15 minutes. After that I'm leaving and you won't get another chance ever." Christopher nodded, swallowing hard. Up close, he looked even worse than he had at the funeral. Exhaustion had carved new lines in his face. Weight loss had made his features sharp and hollow. But his eyes held something Jane hadn't expected. Not just regret or desperation, understanding. The kind that came from suffering through consequences rather than just being told about them abstractly. "I was wrong," he started. The words simple, but clearly difficult to force out. "About everything. About you. About the affair that never happened. About throwing you away without believing you, or even asking for your full explanation. My mother showed me fabricated evidence, and I believed it, because it was easier than confronting the truth that she'd been manipulating me my entire life. I chose her word over yours because I was too much of a coward to question someone who'd controlled me since childhood. I destroyed the best thing in my life because I was weak and blind and stupid beyond measure." "Is that supposed to make it better?" Jane asked, her voice flat. "Explaining why you abandoned me doesn't change the fact that you did it. Understanding your reasoning doesn't heal the wounds." "I know. Nothing makes it better. Nothing excuses it or repairs the damage. But I need you to know that I understand now what I did to you. I've spent 6 months living what you lived. I know what it feels like to be cast aside, to watch everything you built disappear, to stand on the outside of your own life, looking in at ruins. I know what it feels like to be alone and afraid and completely powerless. You tried to tell me that night that I'd regret this moment for the rest of my life. You were absolutely right." Jane studied him, this man who had once been her entire world. He looked like a stranger wearing Christopher's face, beaten down by life in ways that should have felt satisfying but just felt sad and empty. "You have proof," Christopher continued, rain running down his face like tears. "I know you do. I know Richard told you everything about what my mother paid him to do. I know you understand exactly how I was manipulated. But you haven't shown me that proof. You haven't given me the relief of knowing the full truth. You've just watched me suffer and wondered if I'd figure it out myself eventually. Would you have believed it if I'd sent you proof?" Jane challenged. "Or would you have thought I'd fabricated it the same way your mother fabricated the evidence against me?" Christopher flinched visibly. "I don't know. Maybe. Probably. I was so far under her control I couldn't see anything clearly. But I see it now, Jane. I see everything now with perfect clarity. Too late to matter, too late to fix anything, but I finally see it all. What do you want from me?" Jane asked, genuinely curious about what answer he could possibly give that would matter. "I want you to know that I'm sorry," Christopher said, his voice breaking. "I want you to understand that losing you was the worst thing that ever happened to me, worse than losing my career or my money or my reputation. I want you to know that you deserve so much better than what I gave you. You sacrificed everything for me, and I repaid you by abandoning you when you needed me most. You were the best person I ever knew, and I destroyed us because I was too blind to see what I had." Jane felt something crack inside her chest. Not forgiveness, not reconciliation, but recognition that this broken man had learned something real from his suffering. Chapter 8. The Choice. Christopher didn't call after that night at the bus stop. Didn't write. Didn't show up at her office or building. The silence stretched for weeks, and Jane found herself strangely unsettled by his complete absence. She'd grown accustomed to his desperate attempts at contact, his letters she burned without reading, his presence haunting the edges of her world like a ghost she couldn't quite banish. Now there was nothing, and the void felt oddly loud in ways silence shouldn't. She learned through her network that Christopher had taken the evidence she'd given him and confronted his mother in a brutal scene witnessed by several staff members. A nurse who'd been present repeated the story to someone who told someone else until it reached Jane's ears through the quiet channels money kept open. Christopher had stood before Diane's wheelchair and read every piece of evidence aloud, his voice shaking with rage and grief and betrayal, while Diane wept and tried to speak through her partial paralysis, unable to defend herself adequately or explain why she'd destroyed his life so thoroughly through her need for control. After that confrontation, Christopher moved his mother to a care facility. Not terrible, Jane heard through multiple sources, but not the luxury accommodations Diane would have expected or felt entitled to. He visited twice weekly, but the warmth was gone, replaced by cold duty and mechanical care. The woman who'd controlled him his entire life now sat alone most days, abandoned by the son she'd tried so hard to possess completely through manipulation and lies. Jane felt nothing hearing this news except tired acknowledgement that destruction created more destruction in endless cycles. That pain begat more pain, like some terrible inheritance passed from generation to generation. She threw herself into work genuinely now, not as distraction from revenge, but as authentic engagement with building something meaningful that would outlast her. Not as distraction from revenge, but as real commitment to creating value. She initiated programs at Ashford Industries to fund scholarships for students from backgrounds like hers. People with talent, but no resources, who needed someone to believe in them when the world had written them off. She remembered viscerally what it felt like to defer her own education for someone else's dreams, to sacrifice her future for someone else's ambitions. And she made certain other people wouldn't have to make that impossible choice. The board approved her initiatives with enthusiasm that surprised her. Apparently Colette had been laying groundwork before she died, preparing them to accept Jane's vision for transforming the company from an entity focused solely on profit into something that created genuine opportunity for people society had dismissed as unworthy. At a foundation event celebrating the first scholarship recipients, Jane gave a speech about second chances and the power of believing in people others had dismissed or underestimated. As she spoke, watching these young people's faces light up with hope they'd been taught not to feel, She caught sight of someone in the back of the room who looked familiar. When she finished and stepped down from the podium, accepting congratulations from board members and donors, she realized it was Natalie's friend from the funeral. The woman who'd spoken to her about Christopher's grief. The woman approached hesitantly, clearly uncertain of her welcome. That was beautiful. Natalie would have loved seeing what you're doing with your resources and influence. She always said you had the biggest heart of anyone she'd ever met, that you cared about people in ways most wealthy people had forgotten how to do. Jane felt her throat tighten unexpectedly, grief for someone she'd barely known washing over her. Thank you. I wish she could have seen this, could have been here to see what came from the life she helped me see differently. She knew, I think. Before she died, she told me she wasn't worried about Christopher in the long run, because she knew you'd eventually remember who you were underneath the anger and pain. She said you were too fundamentally good to stay bitter forever, that it wasn't in your nature. The woman paused, studying Jane's face carefully. She also asked me to tell you something if I ever saw you again. She wanted you to know that Christopher's been volunteering at the free clinic downtown, teaching architecture workshops to kids from the neighborhood where he lives now, helping them see possibilities beyond what their circumstances and zip codes suggest is available to them. She thought you should know he's trying to become someone better, someone who gives back instead of just taking, even if it's too late for your forgiveness or reconciliation. After the woman left, Jane sat alone in the empty event space, watching caterers clean up, processing this information that shouldn't have mattered but somehow did. Christopher was teaching kids architecture. Christopher, who had once sneered at neighborhoods like the one he now lived in, who dismissed entire communities as beneath his notice, was giving back to a community he'd once considered beneath him and unworthy of his time. It didn't change what he'd done to her. It didn't erase the past or heal the wounds he'd inflicted, but it suggested he was trying to become someone different from the man who had thrown her away at that bus stop. Someone who understood what it meant to have nothing and tried to help others who faced the same struggles. Jane made a decision on impulse, driven by something she couldn't quite name. She arranged through intermediaries to anonymously fund the free clinic's expansion, specifically their arts and education programs. Not for Christopher's benefit directly, but because kids in that neighborhood deserved opportunities that geography and economics had denied them. If Christopher happened to benefit from having better resources for his workshops, better materials and space and support, that was merely incidental to the primary purpose. Weeks passed, with a rhythm that didn't revolve around revenge or anger or thoughts of Christopher at all. Jane's life developed patterns that felt almost normal, almost healthy. She worked, she built programs, she created opportunities for others. She went on a few dates with men her social circle introduced, successful professionals who seemed interested in who she was now, though none of them sparked anything real or lasting. She was too changed by everything that had happened, too fundamentally different from who she'd been, to fit easily into anyone else's life or expectations anymore. Then she received an invitation to a community event at the free clinic, delivered by courier with a handwritten note. The director wanted to thank their anonymous donor in person for the funding that had transformed their programs, and somehow they'd figured out it was Jane who'd been behind the expansion. She considered refusing, knowing Christopher would be there, knowing it would be awkward and painful and potentially undo whatever peace she'd managed to construct. But curiosity won out over caution. The clinic was in a converted warehouse, bright and clean despite limited resources and donated equipment. Children's artwork covered the walls in explosions of color and hope. The architecture workshop Christopher led had produced designs for dream buildings, fantastical structures that spoke to imagination, unconstrained by reality or poverty or the limitations adults tried to impose on young minds. Jane arrived late, deliberately, hoping to slip in unnoticed and observe without being observed herself. She stood in back, watching Christopher work with a group of teenagers, helping them understand perspective and proportion with patience that seemed genuine rather than performed. He was patient with them, encouraging in ways that felt authentic, finding value in their rough sketches and helping them see potential in their own work that they'd been taught not to see. He looked different than he had at the bus stop that night in the rain. Still thin, still carrying visible signs of stress and hardship, but there was something in his posture and movements that suggested peace rather than defeat, purpose rather than despair. One of the teenagers, a girl maybe 15 with bright eyes and careful hands that moved with natural grace, held up her design proudly for Christopher to examine. "Mr. Parker, do you think I could really be an architect someday? My counselor says I should be realistic about my options, that I should focus on careers that are more accessible to people like me." Christopher's expression softened in a way Jane recognized from years ago, before everything fell apart. Realistic doesn't mean limiting yourself or accepting what others say you deserve. It means understanding the path might be harder for you than for someone born with advantages and connections. But harder doesn't mean impossible. If you want this, truly want it, you work twice as hard as everyone else. You find people who believe in you, even when you don't believe in yourself. And you never let anyone convince you that your dreams are less valid because of where you started or what your background looks like on paper. The girl beamed, her smile transforming her face, and Christopher's smile in response looked genuine rather than forced or automatic. Jane felt something shift watching this exchange, watching this man who'd once taken everything for granted, now trying to give others what he'd learned to value too late. This was someone trying to give back what he'd once taken for granted, trying to be for these kids what Jane had been for him before he threw it away so casually. After the workshop ended, Christopher started cleaning up supplies with methodical care. Jane stepped forward before she could reconsider, and he froze when he saw her standing there. For a long moment, they just looked at each other across the space of the room. Two people who used to share everything, now separated by choices that couldn't be undone, but maybe could be processed into something bearable with time and effort. "You're the anonymous donor," Christopher said finally. Not a question, but a statement of recognition. The clinic needed funding. The kids deserved better resources than what they had. Thank you for doing this. They're talented. They just need someone to show them that talent matters more than circumstances or zip codes, that dreams are valid regardless of where you start. He paused, studying her face. "I know you didn't do this for me or to benefit me in any way, but it means something that you're helping them. It means more than I can adequately express." "I'm not doing this for you," Jane confirmed firmly. "I'm doing it because I remember what it felt like to be told I wasn't good enough, that my dreams were unrealistic for someone like me from my background. If I can prevent other people from internalizing that message, from giving up before they start, it's worth every dollar spent." Christopher nodded, accepting this without argument or attempt to make it about him. "I read everything in that envelope you gave me. All the evidence of what my mother did, what Richard helped her do. I had it independently verified by 3 different sources to make sure it wasn't fabricated or manipulated. It was all real, every single piece of it. I know it was real. I lived through the consequences of their lies while you believed them. I confronted her with everything. I moved her to a facility where she'll be cared for, but where I don't have to pretend we have a relationship worth preserving or protecting. I visit because it's my responsibility as her son, not because I've forgiven her or want to maintain any real connection." Christopher looked down at the art supplies he was packing away with careful hands. "I also quit pretending any of this was just her fault or just her manipulation. She manipulated me, yes, but I chose to believe her. I chose not to question what she told me. I chose to trust her over you, despite 6 years of you proving your loyalty. That's on me, not just on her." "I know," Jane said quietly. "Acknowledging that doesn't change what happened, but it's something, I suppose. Is there any chance," Christopher started, then stopped himself, shaking his head. Never mind. You've been clear about where we stand. I shouldn't push for more than you're willing to give. But Jane found herself curious, despite her best efforts to maintain distance. Any chance of what? Not reconciliation. I know that's impossible after what I did. But maybe eventually, when enough time has passed and wounds have scarred over, we could exist in the same world without all this pain between us. Maybe someday we could both remember the good parts of what we had without it being poisoned by how it ended. Jane considered this carefully, turning it over in her mind. Maybe. I don't know. I'm still figuring out who I am, separate from being the person you abandoned and separate from being the person who destroyed you in return. When I figure that out, when I understand who I am, independent of our shared history, maybe I'll have an answer for you. Now that's fair and more than I deserve. Christopher finished packing up and stood, meeting her eyes with something that looked like hope, tempered by hard-won realism. For what it's worth, I'm proud of what you've become. Not the wealth or the power, though you wield both extremely well, but the person who funds scholarships and clinics, who remembers what struggling felt like and uses resources to help others escape that struggle. That's who you always were underneath everything else, and I'm glad you found your way back to that core part of yourself. Gee, I'm not back to anything, Jane corrected gently but firmly. I'm someone different now, someone shaped by what you did and what I did in response to it. I can't go back to who I was because that person doesn't exist anymore. I can only move forward as who I've become. Then I hope who you've become finds peace eventually, Christopher said simply, without expectation or demand. You deserve that more than anyone I know. Jane left the clinic feeling unsettled in ways she couldn't quite articulate. She'd expected seeing Christopher to hurt, to stir up anger or resentment or some echo of the love she'd once felt. Instead, she felt something more complicated and harder to name. Sadness for what could have been if circumstances had been different. Recognition that they'd both been damaged by what happened. Cautious acknowledgement that he was trying to become someone better, even if it was too late for them to have any kind of meaningful relationship. She drove home through the city, watching lights blur past her window, and realized something fundamental had shifted in her understanding. She didn't hate Christopher anymore. She didn't love him either. She just saw him as someone who had made terrible mistakes and was trying to live with the consequences while becoming someone capable of better choices and genuine growth. That felt like the closest thing to closure she was likely to get. Not forgiveness, not reconciliation, not even peace exactly. Just acceptance that what happened couldn't be changed, that both of them had been damaged by it in different ways, and that maybe eventually they could exist in the same world without actively causing each other pain or defining themselves through opposition. It wasn't the ending she'd imagined when she'd stepped out of Vivian's car that first night and decided to become powerful enough that Christopher's opinion didn't matter anymore. But maybe it was the ending she needed, the one where she moved forward into a life she'd built for herself, rather than in reaction to what he'd taken from her. Jane went home to the Ashford estate, walked through rooms that had become familiar, and realized she'd finally stopped waiting for revenge to make her whole. She was whole on her own terms, built from her own choices, shaped by her own strength rather than by his cruelty or her response to it. That would have to be enough. Chapter 9. The Reckoning. 3 months passed with quiet Jane had stopped expecting. She worked, she built programs, she existed in a version of her life that wasn't defined by Christopher's absence or presence anymore. She'd achieved something she hadn't realized she was aiming for, a state where he simply wasn't the organizing principle around which everything else revolved. Then she received word that Natalie's friend wanted to see her urgently. They met at a cafe downtown, and the woman's expression was grave in a way that made Jane's chest tighten with apprehension. "It's Christopher," the woman said without preamble. "His mother died yesterday, stroke in her sleep at the facility. He found her when he went for his weekly visit." Jane felt something complicated move through her. Not satisfaction exactly, but not sympathy either. Diane Parker had orchestrated the destruction of Jane's marriage through lies and systematic manipulation. Her death closed a chapter that had been painful for everyone involved in different ways. "How is he handling it?" Jane heard herself ask. "Not well. He's arranging the funeral, but there's almost no one coming. Everyone who knew Diane has either passed away or wants nothing to do with the family after everything that came out. Christopher is handling everything completely alone." She paused. "I know you have no obligation to care, but I thought you should know." Jane sat with this information for 2 days, wrestling with what it meant and whether she had any responsibility to acknowledge it. Diane had destroyed her life, had fabricated evidence, had poisoned Christopher against her. Jane owed that woman nothing, not even acknowledgement of her death, but Christopher was alone, again, still. And despite everything, Jane remembered the man who was now teaching children architecture, who was trying to become someone better even, though it was too late for his own redemption in her eyes. She attended the funeral, standing in the back of a nearly empty church. Christopher was at the front with the priest and maybe 5 other people, most of them facility staff who had cared for Diane. No family friends, no society connections. No one from the life Diane had fought so hard to maintain and control. The service was brief. Christopher gave a eulogy that was honest rather than sentimental. "My mother loved me the only way she knew how, which was by trying to control every aspect of my life. She thought she was protecting me, but she was actually preventing me from becoming someone capable of making good decisions independently. Her manipulation destroyed the best relationship I ever had and damaged me in ways I'm still understanding. I'm grateful she's no longer in pain, and I hope she finds peace in death that she never found in life." It was probably the most honest eulogy anyone had ever given. Several people looked uncomfortable with the brutal truth, but Christopher's voice didn't waver. He'd stopped pretending, stopped protecting his mother's reputation, stopped caring what anyone thought about his willingness to speak plainly about her failures. After the service, people filed out quickly, clearly uncomfortable. Jane waited until the church was empty, except for Christopher standing alone by the casket. She approached slowly, and he turned when he heard footsteps, surprise evident when he saw her standing there. "You came," he said simply. "I came," Jane confirmed. "I'm sorry for your loss, even though the relationship was complicated beyond measure." That's a diplomatic way of saying she destroyed both our lives through her need for control. Christopher smiled without humor. But thank you. I appreciate you being here even though you have every reason not to be." They stood in awkward silence for a moment. Jane studied Christopher's face, seeing exhaustion and grief and relief all mixed together in complicated ways. He'd lost his sister, his mother, his career, his reputation, everything he'd once thought defined him. And somehow he was still standing, still breathing, still trying to become someone better. "What happens now?" Jane asked. "With your mother gone, with everything that's happened, what's next?" Christopher shrugged. "I keep working. I keep teaching the kids at the clinic. I keep trying to figure out how to live with what I did and who I was. That's all I can do, really." "That's not nothing." "It's not redemption either. I can spend the rest of my life trying to be better, and it won't change what I did to you. It won't bring back the years you spent supporting me. It won't erase the night I abandoned you." He looked at her directly. "But it's what I have, the ability to keep trying even though I know I can't actually fix what I broke." Jane felt something shift in her chest. Not forgiveness exactly, but maybe the beginning of something that could eventually become it. "I think that's all any of us can do. Keep trying even when we can't fix everything. Keep moving forward even when we're carrying weight from the past. Are you, Christopher asked, moving forward? Or are you still carrying everything I put on your shoulders? I'm trying, Jane admitted. Some days are easier than others. I've built a life that matters, work that feels meaningful, connections with people who value me. But sometimes I still wake up, and the first thing I feel is anger at what you did, at what you took from me, at the fact that I had to rebuild myself from nothing, because you decided I wasn't worth believing in. I'm sorry, Christopher said, and his voice carried weight his earlier apologies hadn't. Not just that I did it, but that the damage is still affecting you. You deserved better. You deserved someone who would have fought for you instead of abandoning you. You deserved someone who valued your sacrifices instead of taking them for granted. I wasn't that person, and I'm sorry. Jane nodded, accepting this. Thank you. That doesn't fix anything, but it's something. They stood together in the empty church. Two people who had once shared everything, now separated by choices that couldn't be undone, but maybe could be processed into something bearable with time. I should go, Jane said finally. I have a meeting this afternoon. Of course, thank you again for coming. It means more than you probably realize. Jane walked toward the door, then stopped and turned back. Christopher, I want you to know something. What you're doing at the clinic, teaching those kids, giving them possibilities they wouldn't have otherwise, that matters. It doesn't erase what you did to me, but it's valuable on its own terms. Keep doing that. Christopher's expression softened with something that might have been gratitude. I will. It's the only thing I'm doing that feels like it might actually matter in the long run. Jane left the church and climbed into her car, feeling lighter somehow. She'd gone to the funeral out of obligation or curiosity or some impulse she didn't fully understand. She was leaving with something unexpected. Not closure exactly, but maybe the framework for what closure could eventually look like with time and continued effort from both of them. Chapter 10: The Reckoning and Redemption. 6 months passed with gentleness Jane hadn't expected. She continued her work, expanding programs and creating opportunities. Christopher recovered and learned to pace himself, working sustainable hours at the clinic. They existed in the same city, without seeking each other out, but without avoiding each other either. Then Jane received a call from the clinic director. Ms. Ashford, one of Christopher Parker's students, just received a full scholarship to study architecture. First person from our program to achieve that. Christopher asked me to tell you because he thought you'd want to know your funding made it possible. Jane felt warmth spread through her chest. This was what mattered. Not revenge, not destruction, but creating pathways for people who needed them. She sent a brief message through the director. Congratulations to your student. That's a real achievement. His response came back. Thank you. None of this would exist without your funding. You're changing lives. It wasn't reconciliation or forgiveness. It was just two people acknowledging that good things could emerge from terrible circumstances if you chose to build rather than destroy. Jane was at the estate library when Vivian found her. There's someone here to see you. Christopher Parker. He's been waiting outside for an hour. Said he won't leave until you agree to see him, but he won't come inside without permission. Jane's first instinct was to refuse, but curiosity won. Send him in. Christopher entered looking nervous, carrying a portfolio. He'd gained back weight, looked healthier, more grounded. He wasn't the confident man who'd thrown her away, but he wasn't the broken ghost either. Thank you for seeing me, he said. I won't take much time. I wanted to show you something. He opened the portfolio and pulled out architectural drawings. The community center downtown is being redesigned. They held a competition, and I submitted a proposal anonymously. I won. Jane looked at the drawings. They were beautiful, thoughtful, designed to serve community rather than impress wealthy patrons. Congratulations. This is impressive. I want to dedicate the building to Natalie, Christopher said quietly. She taught me that relationships matter more than success, that being good to people is what actually counts. I want to create something that honors that philosophy. Jane felt her throat tighten. She would have loved that. There's more. Christopher pulled out another document. I've established a scholarship fund in your name. Every year, it will provide full support for one student from a disadvantaged background to study architecture. I'm funding it myself. It's not much compared to what you're able to do, but it's my way of trying to give others what you gave me before I threw it away. Jane stared at her name on the document. Why tell me this? Because I wanted you to know that I heard what you said. About mattering without martyrdom, about building something valuable. I've been trying to do that. I wanted you to see that your words had impact. Christopher moved toward the door, then stopped. Jane, I need to say something, and then I'll leave you alone. You don't have to respond, but I need to say it. Jane waited, her heart beating faster. I destroyed us because I was too weak to question my mother and too arrogant to believe in you. I threw away the best relationship I'll ever have. I've spent every day since then understanding exactly what I lost. I don't want reconciliation because I know that's impossible. I don't want forgiveness because I'm not sure I deserve it. I just want you to know that you were right that night. I regret that moment every single day. But I'm trying to make sure that regret produces something useful. Jane felt tears gathering. I appreciate you telling me. I hope you find peace. I hope you do too. You deserve that more than anyone. Christopher looked back one last time. For what it's worth, I'm proud of who you've become. Not just the success, but the person who uses power to help others. That's who you always were. I'm sorry I couldn't see it clearly enough to protect it. After he left, Jane sat alone for a long time. She pulled out her phone and sent a brief message before she could overthink it. The scholarship fund is generous. Thank you, and I hope the community center honors Natalie's memory the way she deserves. His response came quickly. Thank you. That means more than you know. It wasn't reconciliation or forgiveness. It was just two people who had hurt each other finding a way to exist without causing more damage. Jane stood and walked to the window. She'd rebuilt herself here, transformed from someone discarded into someone powerful. But the real transformation had been about rediscovering who she was, underneath all the pain. She picked up her phone and made one final call. Christopher, this is Jane. I wanted to ask if you'd be willing to collaborate on something. I'm expanding my scholarship program, and I think having someone who understands both privilege and loss might be valuable. You'd have advisory input, nothing more. Think about it. She hung up before he could respond. This wasn't forgiveness or reconciliation. This was two people finding a way to build something together that helped others. Her phone buzzed with Christopher's response. I'd be honored to help. Thank you for trusting me. I won't let you down. Jane smiled, and for the first time in a year, the smile felt genuine. We'll see. Let's start small. She walked forward into her future, leaving shadows behind, carrying only what served her. She'd been broken at a bus stop. She'd been rebuilt through anger. She'd finally found herself through choosing to create rather than destroy. That was the inheritance that mattered, not the money or power, but the strength to choose who you became. Jane Ashford walked into her future carrying that strength.